summer, Portland protesters have taken aim at police. Now their sights are set on the home of the city's newest commissioner after his first major vote not to defund the police.
People came, a destructive mob, did destruction on my home.
Now that Oregon voters have decriminalized carrying small amounts of drugs, it might be time to clarify, how small are we talking? And tonight, the Timbers have Georgia on their mind because the guy making sure all the ballots are counted in Atlanta has the Rose City on his. Here's the story.
The handwriting gets me every time. Hey, everybody. Despite what the graphic says behind me, we'll just point it out again. This is the story without Dan Haggerty. I'm Maggie Vespa. Dan is off today because he, like every other American, is both exhilarated and exhausted. I, quite frankly, am running on caffeine, stress, and sheer will. But I'm also very glad to be here, and I'm grateful that you are too. We always are. So before we get started, just remember, even when Dan is gone, contact info remains the same. Use the hashtag HeyDan on Twitter, email the story at kgw.com, reach out to Dan or me on Facebook, and do it all during the show. We're watching for your feedback, your questions, your complaints, your rants, whatever you need to do to get through your Friday. Friday. So nice, isn't it? It's been a weird week here on the show. You might have noticed we got bumped yesterday because of election coverage. And just to be super clear, we're not going to be your home for like the road to 270 or for the ballot counting in states like Georgia. That's not our wheelhouse. We trust that if you're glued to that kind of content, you probably aren't watching us right now anyway. We're going to stay focused tightly on what's happening here at home. That said, really quick, like a good little local news station, we finally found a local tie to a national election. And if I was a guy, by the way, I'd have a tie on and I would do that just to make my point, but I'm not and I don't. This is a turtleneck, so let's just roll the video, shall we? This is the Fulton County, Georgia elections director, Rick Barron. He's in charge of all the vote counting in Atlanta, which has been, as you know, under a bit of a microscope. If we look at Barron under a microscope, we see something very interesting around his neck. Do you notice that? A Portland Timbers lanyard. Turns out he and his brother grew up in Coos Bay and they are lifelong Timbers fans. Go them. The website The Athletic noticed this too. They wrote about it, and then Timbers owner Merritt Paulson found the article and tweeted, "This is the story we need." Very true. So why are we spending the first part of our show talking about a lanyard in Georgia? Well, first of all, it's fun. Sorry. Second, it's a reminder of all the things that we have in common if we just try to find them. We don't have to tell you this is a really divisive moment in American history, and quite frankly, every little bit of unity matters. So, with that inspiring message, let's get into tonight's big story. And that big story is Portland City Commissioner Dan Ryan's first major vote and the consequences of it. Yesterday, the city council, you might have noticed, refused to strip another $18 million from the Portland Police Bureau. And I say another because remember, they already cut $15 million from the Bureau's budget earlier this year. And as the newest member of the council, all eyes were on Dan Ryan. He was kind of widely seen as the possible swing vote here, and swing he did.
The vote for today on this specific amendment is no.
There you have it. So Ryan kind of shot his shot, as they say, and he shot that item down. He and two other commissioners argued the $18 million was a reckless cut that would make Portland less safe. This amid a record year for shootings and violent crimes, and of course amid ongoing protests. And speaking of, a few hours later, activists responded, gathering at Commissioner Dan Ryan's home last night, lighting flares, smashing potted plants, even throwing paint balloons at his home, breaking a window. Police arrived. They declared it an unlawful assembly, but they say everyone ran, and because of that, no one has been arrested. Now, KGW happened to have Commissioner Dan Ryan, before all of that happened, scheduled to appear on Straight Talk with Laurel Porter today. We tape that on Fridays. It runs throughout the weekend. And despite everything he went through last night, the commissioner kept his promise.
Probably the sad thing is I was expecting it and prepared. And so I was safe, me and my fiance, and a lot of communication with my amazing neighbors on the block. And what happened is people came, a destructive mob, and did destruction on my home. And I got home a couple hours ago, and it's been difficult to look at it. I think it says very little about the big picture of Portland. It says a lot about a small group of people that are taking it upon themselves to ignite more stress during a very, very difficult time in our city with COVID, with a mental health crisis that's coming with that, with economic uncertainty, with the houselessness challenge, and of course with the racial reckoning. They're not on message about anything that's helpful, and we have to call it out. We need common sense to take over and take our city back.
Again, that was Commissioner Ryan on Straight Talk. Most of Portland City Council, by the way, has now condemned what happened. We do want to note we reached out. One commissioner, Chloe Eudaly, thus far has been silent on this matter. We'll let you know if that changes. As for those who have spoken out, Mayor Ted Wheeler condemned the vandalism, calling for those responsible to be prosecuted. Commissioner Amanda Fritz called it unacceptable and an attack on the institution of democracy. And then Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, who actually proposed the funding cuts at the center of all of this, also spoke out. In a statement, she said, quote, "I want to be clear. We can disagree and be upset over these issues, but I do not condone what took place at the commissioner's home last night, and those who engaged in the acts need to be held responsible." Now, you see, she mentioned disagreeing over issues, and that may be an understatement because she was very upset with Ryan's no vote last night. Hardesty, remember, is the first black woman to serve on Portland City Council, and she's also a vocal critic of police. In the past, she has accused police officers of disproportionately targeting black Portlanders, and last night, she gave us our quote of the day. On the record, at that council meeting, Hardesty said, quote, "I knew black lives wouldn't matter for long." She also said that police have been making excuses ever since council cut their budget by $15 million back in June. Take a listen.
Since that time, Portland Police has elected to not solve crimes. They've elected to tell community members that because their budget was cut by $15 million, they can't respond. They can't respond to domestic violence calls. They can't respond to windows being broken out. They can't respond to robberies. Their budget is over $200 million, yet because of a $15 million cut, they found themselves unable to solve crimes. Portland Police has one basic job, and it is to solve crime. And they're not that good at it. I want you to know that your vote against this amendment means that the status quo continues on. Black people will continue to be over-policed. Houseless people will continue to be arrested at over 50% of the arrests that Portland Police Bureau will continue to make. And Portlanders will be continuing to deal with the lasting devastation of an over-aggressive police force who believes that they don't have a boss.
Yeah, that was an incredibly pointed speech. So Hardesty added that Portland can't keep saying it stands up for communities of color when it actually, she says, won't do anything for them. Now, all of that said, all that laid out, let's look forward because two members of the council who voted yesterday will no longer be on council come January. Commissioners Amanda Fritz and Commissioner Chloe Eudaly. Fritz is retiring, making a way for Commissioner-elect Carmen Rubio. And Eudaly was defeated in Tuesday's election by, you see him there, Mingus Mapps. So City Council will look a little different in 2 months. And we asked Commissioner-elect Mapps if he were on the City Council already, how would he have voted on the Police Bureau cuts? He didn't quite answer, but he did say that he has some questions about that proposal, like this one.
Well, one of the things that has had me puzzled for the past couple of days is this disconnect between council and the police bureau about the exact effects that these budget cuts will have on services to the city. I think a couple of days we were hearing that a couple of days ago we were hearing from the police department that these cuts might require us to shut down the traffic services. We heard pushback from City Hall that that's not true. I think yesterday we heard calls from or reports from the budget staff saying that these cuts will require cuts to actual police line, real police officers, and that seemed to be a surprise to members of City Council. All of this kind of makes me think that we need to do a little bit more just talking and taking a look at what exactly we're trying to accomplish here.
All right, so that said, there will, of course, be lots of opportunities for Portland City Council to reform the police bureau. They can always propose more cuts to the budget if they want. But there are also upcoming police union contract negotiations starting in January, and the newly passed Police Oversight Board, which has a lot more power to penalize officers who break the rules. And we should note, just last night, the union announced they are suing over that voter-approved measure. So what we're saying is, there's a lot of work to do. You already knew that. We mentioned Commissioner Dan Ryan, by the way, is on Straight Talk with Laurel Porter. You can hear the rest of that interview at a new time tonight because of, what else? NBC's election coverage. Straight Talk with Laurel Porter is on right after this story at 6:30 here on KGW. So we hope you stick around.
Talk of cutting the police budget has been happening since spring. So how did we get here? Calls to defund the police hit a fever pitch after Minneapolis police killed George Floyd and set off weeks of protests across the country. In Portland, those weeks of protests became months. Activists here wanted to see $50 million cut from Portland police. All the while, the Bureau was actually set to receive $3 million more this year. But in response to all the protests, the City Council cut $15 million from their budget, which eliminated 84 positions. Commissioner Chloe Eudaly voted against it, not because she opposed the cuts, but because she thought the cuts didn't go far enough. Another $12 million was cut from the Bureau as part of a citywide budget tightening due to the pandemic. But the protests and calls for defunding continued, and Commissioners Eudaly and Joanne Hardesty pushed for another $18 million in cuts this week. But the other three members of the City Council voted against it, arguing amid ongoing unrest and a historic spike in violent crime, it would make Portland less safe. And that's how we got here.
All right, let's switch topics now, shall we? With all the talk of the elections and here in Portland, the protests, it should not and cannot be ignored that we are currently in the middle of the worst week of COVID-19 cases since the pandemic began, flat out. Just today, the Oregon Health Authority posted 770 new cases and 6 deaths. Yesterday, OHA posted a record-shattering 805 cases and 5 deaths. And today, the country broke its own day-old record, posting 121,280 new cases of COVID-19. Now, especially what's happening here in the state was apparently enough for leaders in Oregon. And this afternoon, Governor Brown announced a 2-week pause of social activities in 5 counties starting on Wednesday. And those counties are Multnomah, Marion, Malheur, Jackson, and Umatilla.
It's alarming that the majority of these cases are not linked to any specific outbreaks, but rather reflective of sporadic community spread. The virus can very quickly snowball out of control. We're seeing that in real time, and certainly lives are at stake.
All right, you just heard from Oregon Governor Kate Brown there, and KGW's Pat Doris is joining me now. He's been covering this story for us all day. So, Pat, we kind of really first wanted to dig into more details on these restrictions. And when we talk about social activities, what are we actually talking about, and kind of what behaviors are people tangibly going to have to change here?
Well, it's basically when you get together in this human need that we have inside with other people. It doesn't matter whether you're knitting or putting together puzzles or sharing wine or whatever. If there's 5 or 6 people that are not in your household and you're getting together inside with them, they think that's dangerous.
Okay, gotcha. So really any gathering with people you don't live with above that 5 or 6 threshold. And then Why the 5 counties that we listed? Why are they only applying this pause in those 5 counties?
Well, I think their feeling was these are the 5 worst counties. They're worried about these cases really rocketing off the charts. And so with these 5 counties, they have 200 cases or more per 100,000 population. It's a metric so that, if you have a tiny county and you only have a tiny number of cases, you're still able to sort of have it be comparable to the big counties. But those are the 5 that are in the most trouble right now, including where we live right here in Multnomah County. But then Washington, Clackamas, and 3 others are also on the bubble. So we may see this spread quite quickly.
All right. Yeah, ominous advice there from the state, and definitely not where we want to be at this point. Pat Doris, really appreciate the insight. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, shifting topics yet again. One of Oregon's newly approved statewide measures is getting a lot of attention nationally. It's Measure 110, which boosts addiction services across the state. But that's not where the headlines are honing in on. We're actually seeing instead a lot of headlines like this one. Oregon just voted to decriminalize heroin, cocaine, and meth. That was in Vice. Or there's this one in the Daily Beast. Oregon votes to legalize possession of small amounts of heroin and cocaine, which got our viewer Mary Brown wondering. I have a question there. There it is. What is a small amount when it's tied to this measure? Mary, that's a great question. Thank you so much for emailing the story at kgw.com. I'm going to answer that specific question in just a second, I promise. But first, we do want to point out that 110 didn't legalize any drugs, contrary to what the Daily Beast wrote in their headline. It just instead seriously reduced the penalties for possession of those drugs. So if someone is caught with a small amount of drugs, they won't go to jail. Instead, they could face a $100 fine, and they have to talk to an addiction treatment professional. Okay, so now to the question. As to what a small amount is, Oregon lawmakers decided that when they wrote the criminal codes on drugs. And this is what they decided. A gram or less of heroin is considered a small amount. Same with 2 grams or less of cocaine and meth, less than a gram of MDMA or 5 pills, and less than 40 user units of LSD. Let's keep going, shall we? Continuing with methadone, we're going to get really specific here. Less than 40 user units is considered a small amount, less than 40 oxycodone pills, and less than 12 grams of psilocybin. And of course, Oregon voters also passed Measure 109, which legalized medical psilocybin, and that is the psychoactive ingredient in magic mushrooms. But medical psilocybin has to be bought and administered in authorized facilities, so these two measures should not conflict with each other.
When the story continues, probably not surprising that a lot of you have questions about the election. So we'll answer one about who controls the Senate if there's a tie, and what the FBI calls a homegrown terrorist in Multnomah County. How investigators say he was helping ISIS from Troutdale.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Story. I'm Maggie Vespa. I'm in for Dan on one night and one night only. Why is that in the prompter? Would it be okay if I was here for a couple of nights? It's one night only though. He's just off. He's hanging out with the family and kind of decompressing, as we all should be at some point this week. The hashtag remains the same as always. Hey Dan on Twitter. You can email The Story at kgw.com. And I know at the very top of the show we said we're not going to get into the electoral mess. We're leaving that up to the vastly more qualified people at NBC. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the election is the thing on a lot of your minds, especially because it's not just the White House that's hanging in the balance. The U.S. Senate is as well right now, too. So Arlene Reitz emailed us asking who becomes the Senate leader if the Senate is split 50-50. That is a great question, because there are enough right now, as you know, uncalled Senate races that it's still possible for the U.S. Senate to be tied 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. Now, right now, Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell is the Republican majority leader because there are more Republican senators than there are Democratic ones. But if there is no majority in the Senate, the question is who's in charge? Well, it all comes down to who becomes the next president, because if there is a tie in the Senate, the vice president casts the tie-breaking vote. So whichever party controls the White House basically gets majority control of the Senate. As you might imagine, this is incredibly rare, but it has happened in American history as recently as 2000, because that tie, though, was very brief because a Republican senator actually switched parties and gave Democrats control. Before that, it happened in 1953, and it actually happened for the first time in 1881. Again, that's super interesting. We love diving into history, especially. So, Arlene, thank you so much for the question. We hope that helps. Then we got this question, different one, about the presidential election from Karen. She wrote, who is paying for all of these lawsuits? Is it us, the taxpayers? Karen, that's a great question. So you've probably seen President Trump's campaign has filed lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada, and Georgia to try and stop ballot counting. Some of them have already been dismissed by judges. But we took Karen's question to Chris Shortell, a political science professor at PSU. And he says, short answer, no. Taxpayers are not footing the bills for these lawsuits. They're all being paid for by the Trump campaign or by the Republican National Committee, neither of which, of course, are part of the government. The only way taxpayer money could get involved is if the Department of Justice files a lawsuit related to the election, which Chris says they have not done. And as far as he sees, they have no reason to do so. However, we should mention, kind of on the reverse end, that states being sued may have to use taxpayer money to defend themselves, which happens with any lawsuit brought against a state. All right, I think that's enough sort of politics for like a week, right? We thought so. All right, moving on to a story that, though, is equally as serious. This week, the FBI arrested a man on terrorism charges. He is accused, it turns out, of helping ISIS. So why are we paying attention to this story here at KGW? Well, because the guy is from Troutdale. Here's Kyle Laboshi.
Federal prosecutors claim Hawazin Mothafar spent years helping the terrorist organization ISIS produce and distribute propaganda. The Troutdale man was indicted on federal terrorism charges.
This is somewhat of a new facet of the Islamic State's global network of their supporters and how they're expected to play a role in the organization.
Bennett Clifford, co-author of the soon-to-be-released book Homegrown ISIS in America, says the Oregon case highlights how the Islamic State is now looking to crowdsource its media operations. Mothafar, who is confined to a wheelchair, allegedly coordinated with operatives overseas to help create ISIS propaganda and recruiting material on social media. He also helped publish 32 issues of a pro-ISIS newspaper, according to a federal indictment.
It's interesting that, in this new environment related to terrorist groups, he was able to find himself a role solely by broadcasting, this propaganda online, which didn't require any physical action.
Court records allege Mothafar, a legal permanent resident, provided technical support to ISIS officials, including help opening social media and email accounts and moderating private chat rooms. Prosecutors say the 31-year-old also reached out to competing Islamic groups.
And what the FBI calls it is buffet table extremism. It's when extremist actors cherry-pick different parts of extremist ideologies to justify their overall worldview.
Mothafar could not be reached for comment. He's pleading not guilty and was released from custody while awaiting trial. If convicted, the Troutdale man could face 35 years in prison. Kyle Laboshi, KGW News.
All right, we're sure that you have a lot of questions tonight, so we're digging through our social media and our email now. Send them to us if you haven't already. Again, the story at kgw.com. Use the hashtag HeyDan, and we're going to read some of those comments and answer your questions when we come back. We love boo-boos here at The Story. We got a bunch of emails and a bunch of kind of comments on social media, and I'm just going to read one of them here. Hawk wrote in, cool name, the map that you showed in the opening of the show was of Missouri, not Georgia. And then it was very nice of you, Hawk, by the way. You went, oops, with a little smiley face. And we appreciate that tone. Our editor, Zach Carver, sent us this photo of his reaction. Oh, so sad. Zach, we should point out, edits the vast majority of the content you see on The Story, which we happen to think is phenomenal because of him. He is one of the best, if not the best, editors in the business. He handles a ton of content every day. He made one little boo-boo. We're all exhausted. And Zach says, we're so sorry, and it won't happen again. The last question we wanted to point out, Bill asked, how did protesters know where Commissioner Dan Ryan lives? Public records, my man. They can just look it up. They can look up a lot of people's addresses. And again, they've been there 4 times this week. So word has spread, unfortunately. We hope he stays safe. That's it for us, everybody. Straight Talk is up next. Have a great weekend.